Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to Hydro and Nobel Peace Center's Real Business Seminar. Today, we will explore a theme that is really close to my heart, the role of business in society, and how it can contribute to protecting and strengthening human rights. And therefore, it is with much appreciation and gratefulness that we today have a full house and a waiting list and many, many viewers watching us on screen. Again, warmly welcome. Norway is a country where people love watching football. And yet, I know numerous of people in Norway that refuse to watch the World Cup as their own private protest. I am encouraged to see how the World Cup in Qatar has put human rights abuses by governments and businesses on the spotlight. I have never seen this level of attention and reaction from ordinary people. We at the Nobel Peace Center believe that ordinary people can do a difference. Ordinary people standing up for their rights and the rights of others can make all the difference. This year's Nobel Peace Prize to civil society organizations and human rights defenders in Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus reminds us of the critical importance of civil society to protect our human rights if we wish to nourish strong democracies. And we do want to protect our democracies, since they are statistically the less likely form of governments to go to war. We must hope that this example and many other examples of people, companies, and governments keeping human rights high on the agenda will make it easier to achieve lasting change. I see opportunities and threats here. Sustainability, corporate social responsibility, environmental and social governance, sustainable development goals. All these points to a growing recognition that companies must and can play an important part in protecting human rights. More and more companies see this not only as important for their reputation, but also to their bottom line. Companies are cleaning up their supply chain. They are integrating diversity into their structures. They are setting higher ethical standards. But at the same time, there is much work to be done. Between the evidence we see of child labor in dangerous supply chains, surveillance-driven business models in the tech world which threaten privacy, all the way to the inadequate COP27 outcomes, we must not be complacent. Therefore, I feel strongly that everyone that has the slightest power or means need to ask him or herself, what can I do to support and protect the nature, society, human rights, and democracy? And I feel it's particularly important if you are heading an organization or a business. How will I lead in order to be part of the solution rather than the problem? There is much businesses can do. In fact, we cannot tackle the world's enormous challenges without business. Therefore, to shed a light on this issue today, I'm very proud to say that we have speakers here today with a vast and impressive competence. The aim of today's seminar is to start a positive dialogue around how businesses and society together can navigate the new world order for the benefit of humankind. Let us take this opportunity to learn and to see how we can do what is, in the words of Alfred Nobel's will, to the greatest benefit of humankind. Again, warmly welcome. I hope you will enjoy this morning, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Kjersti, for setting the tone for today's event and for hosting us here at the Nobel Peace Center. It is such a privilege and an honor to be here. Ladies and gentlemen, let me extend once again a very warm welcome to you all. I'm Ghida Fakhry. I'm host and executive producer of TRT World's flagship programs out of Washington, D.C., and I'm delighted to be here to moderate today's panels. Now, as we meet in Oslo, as Kjersti just mentioned, on the eve of the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony, we are reminded of the critically important work that this year's laureates, all human rights defenders, have done. We're also reminded of the important role that civil society plays in every country, and within civil society, the mighty business community. As Anita Roddick, who founded the Body Shop almost 50 years ago, warned us, quote, "There is no more powerful institution in society than business. The business of business should not be about money, it should be about responsibility. It should be about public good, not private greed." And I think all of us here today can agree on that. But we also know that big business, transnational corporations, are about money. And sadly, all too rarely are they about what's in the public interest. If they can, and when they can, they go as far as covering up what the public would surely object about. We've seen it with extractive industries, we've seen it with oil and gas, we've seen it with big tobacco, big pharma, the agribusiness. We've seen it all around. And in some cases, there is enough evidence to suggest that big business is even fueling conflict and war. Just look around, everywhere in the global south, but even here in the north. Big business talks the talk, it does, but does it walk the walk? Let me be blunt, and the organizers have asked me to be quite honest in our discussion here today. Can we truly expect big business to sacrifice their profits in the name of social justice, or even to save the planet, unless it is compelled to do so? Now, of course, you'll say there are exceptions. There always are, but by definition, this is what they are, exceptions. Are we fooling ourselves to think or even hope that the corporate world will be guided by ethics, by the notion that the public good trumps corporate profits? Is the tide slowly shifting? At the same time, though, you've got all these disruptions going on around us in this post-pandemic world. Supply chain disruptions, a war not too far away from here, all of these challenging what we embraced 30 years ago, namely globalization, and with it, the very foundations of capitalism as we know it, namely international trade. So let's be honest. Could Karl Marx have been right when he talked about the contradictions of capitalism ultimately potentially bringing about its demise, and perhaps even the demise of the planet as we know it? Marx referred to the exploitation inherent in capitalism. In today's terminology, human rights. It is fundamentally the same, isn't it? Over the course of the next 2 hours, we'll be putting the relationship between business and human rights and corporate responsibility to the test. The purpose of the dialogue will be to have a positive, constructive, honest, yet critical and unfiltered debate. So can big business, can it be part of the solution, and what will it take? To help us frame this discussion, we are fortunate to have with us a team from The Economist Impact that has conducted independent research looking at where businesses stand today, business in an era of heightened geopolitical instability, from the disruptions that have been caused by the supply chains around the world, the geopolitical rivalries and tensions, to everything else that you can think about. We're fortunate to have with us the team who put together this report, Edward Dennett and Mattis Samuel. Mattis, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ghida, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As Ghida mentioned, my name is Mattis Samuel, and I'm a senior research manager at Economist Impact, the research arm of the Economist Group. We work with governments and businesses around the world to address the most pressing issues of the day. And we are really delighted to be here today as a part of the conversation because we deeply believe that the global political and economic order is undergoing a fundamental change that has a profound impact on the way governments, international institutions, but predominantly businesses operate. We are entering a new era of heightened geopolitical risk. So we have seen that global order is shifting and it creates new cleavages and new challenges that lead to increased frequency of disruptive events. Obviously, we all see what is happening with the war in Ukraine, but also the ongoing US-China tensions. And as a result, global businesses have to operate in a new and fundamentally different environment of heightened geopolitical risk and volatile geopolitical context. And to really understand these dynamics, we have been working with Hydro and the Nobel Peace Center to develop a thorough understanding, or at least a beginning of a better understanding of what geopolitical risks mean for global businesses and for their priorities, for their operations, and for their performance. In order to do that, we have developed a program that is centered around a survey of global executives in 3 key regions: the US, Europe, and emerging Asia, and combine that, the results and the insights with a comprehensive expert interview program, as well as a review of existing macroeconomic and global risk data. And so what are the results? What have we seen? And we will discuss, obviously, all of this in much more detail in the next couple of hours, and you can read it in the report available online. But to give you a quick overview, we have seen that indeed global businesses are feeling and adapting to increased geopolitical tensions and the risks associated with them. And they are feeling this particularly through 2 channels of impact. On one hand, we have the immediate short-term disruptions, and on the other, it's sort of more structural, diverging, and intensifying market pressures. In terms of the immediate disruptions, we see particularly the impacts of increase in input prices, a lack of availability of global labor supply, and global supply chain disruptions. On the side of the market pressures, we have seen that there is a strong and increasing demand for corporate responsibility, as well as long-term sustainability. We have also seen an increasing pressure coming from tightening environmental regulations, and of course, the disruption caused by international sanctions. And all these means that businesses have to adopt their priorities, their preferences, their behaviors. And we have seen indeed that in terms of the priorities and in terms of the reflection on the most important aspects of business operations, diversification of supply chain, diversification of production, as well as greater resilience and long-term sustainability are coming up high as priorities. At the same time, businesses need to face market realities. And these are coming particularly from the stickiness of supply chains as well as shareholder demands. And as a result, we are seeing tangible but very gradual adaptation and adjustment of business priorities and operations. And I'll ask my colleague Ed to run us through these findings in much greater detail. Over to you, Ed, and thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Mattis, and hello, everyone. Among the major disruptions brought on by geopolitical instability, input price rises were the most popular selection cited by our businesses. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has clearly exacerbated and accelerated already rising input prices, creating major cost issues for businesses. These rising costs are weighing on profits, and also inevitably they're forcing businesses to pass on that cost increase into the price of their goods. And in the long run, we expect this is going to have marked implications for, of course, the competitiveness of those goods in export markets. And so when thinking about the areas most affected, of course, Europe comes to mind. You can see here in our graphic, on the left, we see a sharp increase in producer prices within Europe in the last year. And this is likely, this comparative increase in prices is likely to weigh on the region and businesses within that region, their competitiveness within global export markets. Comparatively, of course, the US is also seeing price increases, and also Asia for different factors. Similarly, supply chain disruptions were among the most common cited issues brought on by geopolitical instability today. Businesses are struggling amid ongoing and re-emerging COVID-19 lockdowns, among previous trade wars, among open conflicts, and of course, economic sanctions. These factors are all forcing businesses to reorganize their supply chains, potentially consider alternate options to certain markets, and of course, this also carries inherent costs. Businesses forced to reorganize their supply chains must allocate investment elsewhere, and that comes at a cost. But also, it offers opportunity costs. Businesses originally were encouraged to go to these certain markets for the perceived competitive advantage there. Historically, in our, let's say, more benign global geopolitical order, businesses were encouraged to offshore and seek economic opportunity abroad. The status quo has now changed, and clearly geopolitical instability is putting those operations at risk, and so we see businesses facing that short-term disruption. Moving towards the diverging market pressures, it's clear that across the board, businesses are facing increasing pressure to be more responsible and sustainable. Interestingly, though, the pace and the extent of that pressure differs between our regions in our study. Taking the demand for corporate responsibility, it's clear that businesses are facing an active civil society, which is demanding and expecting accountability and transparency within business operations, as well as the operations of their suppliers, of their partners, of their political associations. And so this social pressure, businesses are having to consider increasingly so. And of course, this has been exacerbated by the separation within our geopolitical order and these broad shifts we're seeing. Interestingly, in the US, we saw a particularly high number of businesses reporting that demonstrating progress in areas like corporate responsibility has a direct impact on their customer base as well as their revenues. And so we're starting to see businesses taking account for the fact that this now actually has a direct impact on their more traditional business performance metrics also. Of course, the other side of that pressure on businesses is the regulatory pressure. And climate presents a particularly interesting example. Once again, we see our regions moving at different paces in the extent to which regulators are tightening the screws on businesses in this important issue. Europe, of course, is some way in the lead at this stage, but fascinatingly, the US is making marked efforts to close that gap. And we've also seen similar action in emerging Asia within India and China. Interestingly, for the US, the legislation and the regulation we've seen in the previous year directed at improving their climate positive factors, in part also becomes a renewed sphere for competition. Much of the legislation is aimed squarely at taking that market share from places like China. And so we expect to see this to be a yet further battleground for further geopolitical instability. So what does this mean for businesses operating within this new geopolitical environment? What's the outlook for that business? It's clear that we see that businesses are understanding the pressure and feeling these pressures coming from these geopolitical drivers. But when understanding the scale and the pace of the change we may be seeing, it's important to consider the other factors that business must also consider when making their decisions, when designing their strategies. Taking the example of corporate responsibility. Businesses responding to our survey clearly demonstrate that they understand they should be actively advocating and championing causes of society, environmental causes, and also those political. However, when asking them about, for example, their investment priorities, or whether they think businesses should in general maximize profits as opposed to maximize their metrics more designed to corporate responsibility, we start to see a disconnect. 51% of the businesses responding to our survey cited that actually businesses in general tend to favor that maximizing of those profits. And of course, that is the reality, that businesses are beholden to their shareholders and their stakeholders. But what we see, and I think what we can all see broadly in the business environment, is a dissonance between the stated preference, what businesses understand they should be doing, and the realities that they are facing in our world today. Finally, when understanding the reactions to these disruptions that businesses are facing, of course, supply chains presents a fascinating example. Businesses understand that their operations in certain markets are now increasingly at risk. The premiums against those are rising. But for many, that decision to perhaps exit a market or to fortify or to diversify must also be weighed against the economic opportunities that remain in those markets. And so while geopolitical pressures are rising, of course we see businesses increasingly diversifying their supply chains. But looking at the data, you do not see a vast outflow of businesses from these quote-unquote risky markets now. What we think we're seeing is a gradual shift in business strategy, an understanding that our systems built on efficiency should be moving towards resilience. But that change, of course, takes time. Supply chains are inherently sticky, and businesses will wait often until their next decision-making juncture to then decide, do our risks premiums outweigh the economic opportunities available? But of course, the important thing to consider is that balance, that equation, must always be accounted for. I'm very happy to say that these findings are going to be taken further today in a fantastic discussion across 2 panels, which we are very excited to be taking part in ourselves. And I very much hope that this discussion can be taken further today and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ed. Thank you, Mattis, for these findings, for the work that went into producing this piece of independent research. You come up with recommendations as well: prudence, agility, collaboration. To what extent are businesses getting it? Because as you just showed us in your presentation, 51% of businesses still would put profit ahead of any notion of social responsibility. Change is coming, we're told, but it is going to be gradual. We know that companies often have the means, they have the resources, they certainly have the wherewithal to make change happen. Do they have the will? Do they have the incentive, the courage, and the vision to act on the findings and the data that is plain for everyone to see. The world is certainly facing a whole host of challenges, as we just heard, according to the Economist Impacts Report: geopolitical instability and competition, diverging ideologies, trade wars, conflicts, economic sanctions. They're all impacting the way businesses operate around the world. Meantime, as we've just heard, consumers and regulators are putting pressure on companies and businesses to be more transparent, to be more accountable for their activities in foreign markets. But how serious are they, and just how serious are we about it? Crucially, will this rising social pressure lead to a fundamental structural shift? Will it lead to a new corporate responsibility, something we often hear a lot about, a new way of doing business, or is it going to be business as usual? Ultimately, how much are we ready to sacrifice as nations, as consumers? More and more businesses are taking a stand on issues like the FIFA World Cup, certainly on the war in Ukraine, but not on many other issues, certainly not on all conflicts across the board. Can they be compelled to change? These are all questions that we will be exploring, and who best to kickstart our discussions with, and someone who's been at the center of all the geopolitical and socioeconomic shifts of the last few years, as president of the World Economic Forum since 2017. His previous positions as Secretary General of the Norwegian Red Cross, as Norway's Minister of the Environment, Minister of Trade and Industry, Minister of Foreign Affairs, put him all at the nexus of business, human rights, government, and civil society. It's my privilege to welcome Børge Brende. Mr. President, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ghida. And I'm jealous when it comes to being in Oslo. I wish I could have joined you physically. And thank you for this very sobering opening from also The Economist. And the good news, though, is that we see clear correlation between businesses that do take corporate social responsibility seriously and also how profitable they are. I think the future is really about human capital, who has the best chances to recruit the best people, and the best people want to work for businesses and companies that takes this very, very seriously. So that's at least a bit of a silver lining. But of course, companies also have to be profitable to secure also jobs for the future. I'm very thankful to be invited, and a special thank you to Hydro, of course, and to the CEO, Hilde Merete Aasheim, and is doing such a great job in this field, and also showing a lot of leadership, and to the Nobel Peace Center for convening this dialogue on how business can drive positive change. We are definitely meeting at a critical moment, the closing weeks of a year that has unfortunately been marked by immense challenge and instability, as I already mentioned, the Economist report showed us. The other week I was in Washington, D.C. and made a similar speech, and I was asked the tough question, how is really the global economy doing? And I was wondering how to respond to that. And I had to be candid, as also Gina asked us to be. And I said, the global economy is worse than last year, but better than next year. That's unfortunately the situation. But I think this meeting is also about how to change that path. Are there things we can do to improve the current situation? Of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a terrible break of humanitarian law and also international law, and has cost thousands of lives and uprooted 14 million people from their homes. We know also that we are seeing an energy crisis, the first one since 1972. Oil prices has been like a roller coaster. During the pandemic, the oil price collapsed. Then it suddenly shot up to 120 US dollars per barrel over the summer. And now I think it sits about right 80 US dollars. So it shows also the volatility that we are faced with. And this, among other things, because of the instability of the global value chains, we have seen inflation close to 8% in the largest economy in the world, in the US. It's still 25% of the global economy, the US, with 5% of the population. And the inflation now in Europe is 10%. This is the highest levels in 40 years. And although pressure appears to be easing, the European Central Bank warned last week it hasn't peaked in the Eurozone at 10%. This turbulence is straining and already brittle global economy. And our economist has forecasted that global growth will slow from 6% last year to 3.2% this year, with a global recession looming ahead. We just don't know how it's going to look next year. So to avoid repeating the low growth that took place during the 1970s, we had a decade with low growth. We really need now to agree on a global growth agenda. And this will be one of the main topics also for our annual meeting at the World Economic Forum taking place in January in Davos, how to revive growth. And to revive growth, we have to continue to trade and invest. Without a trade recovery, there will be no real recovery. If we continue with this beggar thy neighbor instead of prosper your neighbor strategy, we will shave off a lot of growth in the years to come, and we will see growing poverty rate for the first time in 3 decades. And along with these economic and security challenges, the energy crisis, as I mentioned, is still unfolding, and the planet continues to warm at an alarming rate. Let's not forget that. The only way we can solve these challenges and unlock new opportunities ahead is through purpose-driven collaboration. Thankfully, despite the growing risk of fracture, there have been some bright signs over the last several weeks. In November, the US and China sat together in Bali and restored a climate dialogue. That's crucial. This is almost 50% of the global economy, and a lot of the global emission comes from these two big economies. And the G20 reaffirmed the need for greater economic cooperation and also to stop nuclear proliferation. The nuclear piece, I'm really worried. Of course, these consensus in these areas are encouraging, but we need also to be realistic. Because in today's geopolitical context, and at the time when the United Nations has warned time is running out to meet our global goals, we can't take collaboration for granted, which is why we need the private sector to be part of the fabric of cooperation. This is, of course, is one of the key recommendations also in the Economist report that we just saw being presented for more collaboration between businesses and government is crucial, critical. More and more companies are, though, stepping up, particularly when it comes to priorities like reaching net zero targets and making purpose-driven investments. Hydro, for instance, has said it wants to be a front runner in low carbon and zero carbon practices and help move the industry toward these goals. Congratulations, and thank you for that leadership. And at the World Economic Forum, we are also bringing together governments and businesses for initiatives such as the First Movers Coalition, which is aligning more than 60 companies globally, many of them Fortune 100 companies, including Apple and Amazon, in making green purchasing commitments, using their purchasing power to green their supply side. No, as we chart the course for the year ahead, it is time for business to commit to working with one another to bring about positive change, because it is the only way toward a stronger future. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for bringing such a great conference together on those critical topics.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brande. Let me do a very quick couple of follow-ups, if I can, on what you've just said. You mentioned the word collaboration, obviously a key word that's being bandied around quite a bit these days. You talked about the First Movers Coalition, which is a collaboration between the US government and the World Economic Forum, essentially bringing together companies and governments to shape low-carbon consumption. You have said that we need the private sector, but the private sector has, in fairness, stepped in, hasn't it, to fill the gaps left by governments when it comes to climate change. We know that governments often make lofty promises, don't always follow through on them. Isn't this collaboration essentially, in a way, passing the buck to the private sector, asking them to do more?
I think the private sector can do more. You know, many companies have now said that they will also go net zero in 2050. We have 120 of them in an alliance for CEO climate leaders at the World Economic Forum. So they are walking the talk. But many governments are also doing a lot. And I think this collaboration between governments and business is critical. But I think the First Movers Coalition is one of the examples where it really makes so sense to use businesses also to set an example. Last fall, I sat down with Secretary John Kerry, and we said, how can we in Glasgow mobilize business to use their huge power to change? And then we got this idea of bringing the big companies of the world together and say, we will only buy, for example, then steel or fertilizers or aluminium, where we see that the processes are greener. And that signal, you know, when Apple says that for our iPhones, we will only accept these and these from our suppliers, everyone wants to sell to these companies. So that is like really, really powerful. And we need more of this in the years to come.
You say we need more of this, but the reality is, and one of the key findings in today's report is that businesses will always put profits first. Their responsibilities towards society will come second, which in reality means last. It is naive, isn't it, to think that a child will be reasonable in a candy store. Doesn't the same go for big business? Can we hope that they will change just like that? Or do governments have to stop their active complicity as well? You were in government.
Yes, of course, there are dilemmas when you are also CEO of a big company. Every company has to be profitable. If you're not profitable, you are not securing the jobs. And you have also a huge responsibility towards your own employees and also to those that own your company. I believe in profitable companies, but I also believe strongly in decoupling growth from, for example, growth in CO2 emissions and everything that is harmful. And as I started to say, over time, we also see that the most profitable companies are those that take gender, that takes anti-corruption work, that takes the green agenda seriously. So I hope that this will inspire more private sector also to step up. But we need profitable companies also to make the right investments in a green future, in my view.
Thank you very much, Mr. Borge Brende. Of course, we could go on, but I think I'll save my questions for when we sit down together for an interview. Thank you so much, indeed, for being with us here today. Sustainable companies, a sustainable way of doing business, a sustainable planet as well, when you consider what today's models of economic growth mean for the planet, which is overheating, when you consider the growing inequalities as well, when you have the world's top 26 billionaires owning more than the bottom 3.8 billion people in the world. That's more than 50% of the world's population. Something is essentially wrong, isn't it, with our economic system today? Can we do with band-aids, with half measures, or does the problem require a more radical approach? So on to our first panel. How does global uncertainty affect businesses' ambitions to improve supply chain and human rights conditions? What is the role of business in the new world order? Can they be the drivers of that positive change? The pandemic first, then the war, both having exposed the weaknesses in global trade and supply chains. What are businesses doing to address and fix those weaknesses, and how is this affecting businesses' ambitions to improve their human rights conditions? Paul Polman, you served for a decade, between 2009 to 2019, as CEO of one of the world's largest consumer goods companies, Unilever. You also served on the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. You also co-wrote a book about how, quote, courageous companies thrive by giving more than they take. When you look at all the rapid changes that we've been talking about today, the disruptions, the instabilities from the pandemic, which seemed at one point that it would never end, to a war in Europe whose end isn't quite in sight. When you hear Ed and Mattis talk about the slow pace of change, that companies get it, but it will take time for things to change. Can businesses afford to take their time, to be more cautious, more prudent? What should their key priority be?
Well, the direct answer is we can't afford it. We're running out of time. And the music stops playing. I mean, you talk about the kid in the candy store, but there isn't much candy anymore. So also for businesses itself, people are starting to realize that there aren't any jobs on a dead planet, that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet, that destruction of biodiversity or living well beyond our planetary boundaries is giving us things like COVID and other issues to deal with. And all of that gets into a P&L of a company. So when you talk about this trade-off that was being presented between maximizing profit and being socially responsible, I'm not so sure that we're really asking the right question or analyzing it in the right way. In the end, actually, we are getting increasing evidence, and it's not all black and white, but we're getting increasing evidence that the only way to optimize, and I deliberately use optimize versus maximize, but the only way to long-term optimize your profits is to actually run business models that are more socially, environmentally, human responsible. And I think the companies that are starting to understand that are actually getting the benefits from that. We're seeing it reflected in their market caps increasingly. So we're seeing it in ESG funds outperforming. So this trade-off that we were dealing with also when I started with Unilever, that skepticism that was there in society, not least the financial markets, increasingly is different. So, and it's changing. And the answer to your question is, are we changing? Yes. Are we changing fast enough? No. In the financial crisis, we had an opportunity to address. We missed the opportunity. People felt left behind. People actually felt banks were too big to fail, but people were too small to matter. And the 10 years that followed the financial crisis, climate change went up, discontent from civil society went up. You got the Brexits, you got the Trumps, and all the things I don't need to explain to you. In COVID, it is quite different. When COVID happened, and we all had this little pause, if you want to, I think because of the complexities of the issues became transparent. People started to realize that you can't have healthy people on an unhealthy planet, that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And people started to ask themselves questions. All of a sudden, a zoonotic disease like COVID, by the way, SARS, Ebola, Zika, Asian flu, we had enough of them. This is a particularly nasty one. There are probably 3 or 4 around the corner. But people thought, hey, that is related to destruction of biodiversity. Then all of a sudden, you see that the poor and disadvantaged suffered disproportionately. So it is related. They always seem to pay the price, children and women especially. So then you see the tragic death of George Floyd brings attention to the racial dimensions of all of this. So people see how this is all connected and start to realize that actions need to be taken. And what you see since COVID is a drastic change in number of companies that are moving up the ESG scale, number of governments that are putting legislations out, number of citizens crying for change, the financial market starting to unlock itself. The reality is that the changes are of such magnitude, which I'm actually happy about. We can talk that later.
But is the change drastic enough, though? I mean, you've said it wasn't fast enough, but is it drastic enough? Because, yes, companies are saying all the right things these days, but there's a lot of spin going on as well.
Absolutely.
They know that it's no longer just a matter of what sounds right, what makes for good business and so on. It's a matter of more than courage, of necessity.
Oh, absolutely.
How do companies give back more than they take, and how does purpose and profit actually coexist?
Well, so we're not going fast enough, and there are not enough companies. And just to mention 50 companies doing this or 100 companies doing that, it's just wasting our time. We need to get it at scale. And it can only happen if we make structural changes to the way we operate our economic systems.
What needs to happen?
Oh, you need to, first and foremost, we need to have a multilateralism that functions. If that doesn't function, I think there's a big bottleneck that business cannot solve by itself. We have not given vaccines to the emerging markets. We've not given a 100 billion fund on climate. We are not really giving them financing right now. We make a loose statements without commitments on loss and damage. The solidarity that we see globally is not there. So one of the things we need to drastically see is a change of the multilateral financing system, the way the international institutions work. The second thing we need is really get climate change higher on the agenda. We've discussed for 30 years in climate, COP27 is basically 28 years of talking this, and we still came out of Sharm el-Sheikh, where I was without an agreement to reduce fossil fuel. And give me a break. So it's outright disappointing what we're getting. So we need to get climate on the agenda, and I think we need to get business to significantly change their social contract with society, and require from business that they deliver on more than just the bottom line.
It raises that question, who the culprit is. Is it governments or corporations?
It's all of us. It's all of us. I don't
governments who at best look the other way. All of us. We're all in this together, as we often hear. Let me just quickly put a question to Berit Lindeman, who is the General Secretary of the Norwegian Helsinki Committee, a human rights NGO based here in Oslo, which was founded in 1977. One of your key responsibilities is to make sure that the committee's work on human rights in Europe translates on a practical level, that it is respected in practice. Now, we usually think of governments abiding by these principles. How do you ensure that the private sector, that businesses are held to similar standards and that they deliver? Paul just talked about multilateralism. How do you make that relevant to the human rights sector when it comes to how businesses need to perform and deliver?
Yes, thank you. If you permit, you mentioned Marx. In the beginning, I thoroughly enjoyed that. I would quote a less philosophical of the communist, Lenin. He said that business will sell us the rope that we will use to hang them, and we keep selling rope. And we have talked about what is creating the financial crisis, the economical crisis, what is reducing the income on companies now? It's the lack of sustainable governance. We have talked about Russia. Let's think 20 years back in time. What if we had held Putin to responsibility on democracy and human rights? The Nobel Peace Prize winners have warned against Putin for 20 years and said that it will lead to all downfall. At the same time, governments encouraged investments, companies invested in Russia without asking anything in return. If we try to hold Putin to responsibility, if we encouraged or pushed governments to respect and demand compliance on human rights from Putin, they held back because the interests of the government, of the companies, had to be protected. So we let it go. The Norwegian State Pension Fund invested hugely in Russia. Statoil, Equinor formed partnership with Sechin, Rosneft, one of the biggest culprits in the Russian financial world. And we looked at this. Of course, states have the main responsibility on complying with human rights standards, but business have it too. And it's voluntary. So we need to hold them responsible by making the standards legally binding. Because the voluntary system makes the good companies comply, but the bad companies do not comply. And that is increasing the cost of the good companies. So we have to level the playing field for all international, multinational companies investing. They are investing in countries that are really, really complicated to invest in because there is no respect for fundamental human rights and democratic standards.
But what is the best tool, though, to work with this, to deal with this issue, with this challenge? Because you mentioned Russia, you mentioned Putin, and we know that economic sanctions are being slapped right, left, and center with Russia today. But look at the legacy of sanctions on Cuba, on Iraq, on Iran, and the list goes on. And we see that more often than not, they simply do not work. More often than not, they violate the human rights of the communities, the societies you purport to help. They often have that sort of very damaging collective impact and very seldom affect the people in power. Is that the solution, though, to level the playing field?
Yeah, I think so.
Is it?
I think we need to level the playing field.
But do you do it through sanctions?
Look at the sanctions. Look at the sanctions. Sanctions are like band-aids on the real problem, because the real problem is that we do not adhere to the standards we ought to adhere to. So, and then we see the consequences, and then we slap sanctions to try to somehow remedy what we have faulted on already. But it's one of the tools in the box.
Selectively.
We need to have targeted sanctions against the main violators of human rights. We have to have it. What works on human rights? I mean, look, this country is democratic, but internationally, most countries are becoming less and less democratic. And we have the United Nations, we have the Security Council, we have all sorts of international law that should make us respect human rights, but we don't. So we need to have many tools in the box. And I really do believe that business is one important tool in the box. Actually, I'm very optimistic. I think we are going in that direction.
All right, well, we'll find out what the other panelists think, but let me get to Mette Samo first. As one of the lead authors of the Economist Impacts briefing report, what for you stood out of your own research? What was the most surprising? What was the most important finding in this report? And did we learn anything that we didn't really already know?
Yeah, no, thank you, Ghida. And I think there are a couple of surprising points. As Ed mentioned, for example, the increasing attention being paid by businesses in, for example, the US, but also China, when it comes to the long-term sustainability, environmental issues, at least on paper, right? Those things were not necessarily in place, a couple of years ago or a few years ago. But what I think that the key and important element is that fundamental tension. And I think that we agree here that, yes, in the long term, absolutely, for profitability, the sort of sustainability and the right values are really good for profitability. But in the short term, and as the economic system is currently set up, there is a fundamental cost. And that's because over the past 3 decades, the global economic system has been set around global reorganization of production. And therefore, and it has been, and it has allowed businesses, global businesses, to really increase profits and really work with economies of scale and efficiency gains, right? However, this was conditioned on the fact that we have seen 3 decades of almost unprecedented levels of geopolitical stability and integration. And now that we are seeing that actually there is a unprecedented, or that there is a fragmentation coming, those fundamental benefits of globalization are being questioned, right? And there is a fundamental cost for businesses to track back on these 30 years or 40 years of development of supply chains, development of production processes and operational processes. And we have done some modeling, and we've seen that a potential hypothetical scenario of fragmentation of global trade into sort of 2 or 3 trade regions would cost trillions and trillions of dollars. And that means that the sort of companies, it's expensive for the companies to really abandon the system that has worked so well.
But what will compel them to not abandon the system? Because, I mean, should this be a wake-up call? Listening to you, it seems like, yes, they're doing what they can. They know there's a problem. But, you know, should they be given the luxury of time? And how much change will happen if there isn't real pressure that comes from investors, from civil society? What will compel them to not continue dragging their feet?
Absolutely. I think that's obviously the trillion-dollar question. But I think that now we are seeing that this volatility, these effects, are having real impact on businesses' bottom lines. And that, I think, is the moment where there needs to be a sort of greater business leadership realizing that and promoting that. But on the other hand, as was said, we are all in this together. It is understandable, you know, even despite the past few years of stagnation of global trade integration, still around 70% of global trade is traded around global value chains, which is a huge amount. And now we are seeing, and I think the case of Ukraine and Russia is a clear example that some of this exposure to reputational risks that come from it, the political risks that come from it, is actually really tangible and has tangible financial and economic impacts on businesses. And I think that hopefully, you know, this will be a wake-up call.
Question, though, is will the private sector self-regulate? And we'll get to those issues. But let's first hear from our final panelist, Mahinthan Mariasingham. You are the senior statistician and project officer at the Asian Development Bank, which is headquartered in the Philippines. Your work focusing on producing critical data, evidence-based analysis for policymaking projects. What does your data tell you about the impacts of globalization, both positive and negative, on the supply chain, particularly in light of the critical role that Asian economies, China, India, are playing? And how does your data differ from what you've heard here today?
All right, thank you very much for the opportunity to represent our views as well as what we see in the data. So let me talk about the evolution of the globalization process since the 1990s, because globalization has been around since the beginning of time, ever since people started to trade. However, since the 1990s, a lot of factors have facilitated the globalization process as well as the pace of it. So this includes the evolution of technology, evolution of communication, the trade agreements, and so on, and also geopolitical factors such as the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, China getting further integrated into the global economy, joining the WTO, and of course India opening up. So a lot of these factors allowed the fragmentation of the production processes and then allow businesses to distribute their production processes around the world so that they can make maximum profit. Now, in this process of distributing production processes around the world, many countries have benefited, especially those in the Asian countries, in many ways. First, you can see from the data, countries that used to have a GDP growth rate in 2 to 3, maybe 4% annually, have started to grow at 7 to 10, 11, 12% in this period. And millions of people have been brought out of poverty, especially, for example, in countries like China, India, and many countries in Southeast Asia. And average income even for the lower quartile, the bottom quartile, as well as other economic segments of society, they have gone up. Plus, more and more women have started to enter the workforce. Because women started to enter the workforce, the average income of the household increases, and because of that, fewer children are working and more children are going to school. And the demand for a high quality product demands higher skills, which means governments are investing more in education and skill development. And organizations such as ours, in fact, promote skill development. And so in the last 30 or 40 years, what we have seen is globalization as a whole being a force for good and development in the region as well as in the world.
So you say it's been a force for good, but we also know that a lot of the big brands, and I don't need to name names here, but a lot of the big brands rely on labor, cheap labor, in Asian countries. You talk about more children going to school, but there were also allegations of child labor by some of these companies. Are they taking measures to protect the human rights of workers, even if it means cutting down on profits? Because as we heard today, shareholders are still the ones that companies mostly strive to please.
So the main question here is, there are two things. Human rights is a very subjective, abstract term, right? The main point is whether these companies are adhering to the laws of the countries in which they are operating. Because you cannot apply a Western European concept to an Eastern Asian economy or a society. Should things be different or should things be improved? Yes, that's a subject for another discussion. But when you are looking at a country or a group of countries where if every single member of the household does not earn, they will be descending further into poverty. All right. Often, what we have seen is companies that are part of the global supply chain, global value chain, actually pay more.
Okay.
As a result, given the existing labor laws or environmental laws or other relevant regulations, all these countries are adhering to the existing framework and then contributing to the economic growth.
Are they, and how do we make them adhere even more? Paul, for you, you've led a company, obviously, with such a big global footprint. And Berit, I know you want to also talk about the human rights dimension to this. How do you make sure that, companies aren't just saying the right things, but that they are, in a way, self-regulating themselves? Or do you need to...
Yeah, self-regulation only brings you so far, but much more can be done. And there's no question that many more companies are putting human rights now on their radar screen because it has this higher transparency, and I think expectations of society have changed as well. You'd be stupid not to take that into account. But then I'm still disappointed. We issued about 10 years ago the first human rights report. We've issued 2 since. We've issued a modern-day slavery report. You can all find it online. And I have seen very, very few companies participating. Now you get CEOs knocking on your doors to be on climate panels. They're all experts now, which wasn't the case when we did the COP21, but now they all are there. But on human rights or on corruption or on tax, you won't get anybody on the panel still.
And
so
the UN Global Compact.
Sorry,
and the UN Global Compact.
Well, the UN Global Compact, there are 2
years.
things. The principle of the UN Global Compact is interesting because I happen to chair that for the Secretary General. But we had 12,000 members before COVID. Then we instituted a fee for the first time. So we thought COVID coming, we're in trouble. We actually have 17,000 members now. So to your question, are things changing? They're changing. And these companies are being audited if they adhere to the 10 principles, which has obviously human rights very much in there. You have John Ruggie, the former John Ruggie, a dear friend, who wrote the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So you see more companies being aware of it. But are these companies proactively leading in this area? Very difficult. When we created the Global Consumer Goods Forum, I wanted slavery to be with all of the companies in the Consumer Goods Forum. I want them to make commitments that we together, because it's very difficult for a company to do this alone, together work very hard to take slavery out of the value chain. And American companies didn't want to sign that, legal liabilities. Japanese and Chinese companies didn't know what you were talking about. At the end of the day, I had to say, I'm leaving this organization if we don't sign it. And the simple question question I asked them is, does any of you have children? And please stand up. And so they didn't know what this strange Dutchman was asking them. But at the end I said, if you don't sign up, that means it's okay for you to have your children be treated like this.
Quite often they sign up. They take on the label, but that doesn't mean that they will actually live up to their commitments.
No, it doesn't mean it. But now you can, the world is becoming more transparent. World Benchmark Alliance just issued a report on human rights 2 weeks ago, and it ranks. And you see Unilever on the top, but still a lot to do. We only score 60 out of a potential 100, so I'm not sitting here proclaiming we're perfect. But then you see the Kraft Heinz continuing to be at 5 points or 10 points on the bottom. Now, what is the best thing to change? There are only two things that will change, to be honest. The first one is if you get legislation. Yeah. So we worked very hard on the Modern Day Slavery Act in the UK. We worked very hard putting capabilities in place in countries because it was in our interest. And the second thing that makes people change, if you can show them it's actually better for your business. So countries that better respect human rights have better economic growth. There's a direct graph that we make in the UN where you look at the rights for women, for example, versus men. There are only 6 countries, by the way, in the world where women have the same rights as men. So don't let yourself be fooled into it. Even my native, the Netherlands, you don't have the same rights.
6 out of 193 member states.
Yeah, it's pretty sad. But where the rights of women are better protected, you also see better economic growth, not surprisingly. So what we now see is that companies actually that integrate better the multi-stakeholder, the human rights part, the just transition part, they're actually having better financial performance. The best thing I did with Unilever was not to put a sustainable business model out there, is actually to show that by doing business differently, we still could get to a 300% shareholder return over 10 years. That's what gets the interest of others.
What gets the interest of companies, do you think, Berit? How do you respond to what Paul has just said? And how do you enforce commitments without regulation, to Mahinthan's point? Can we have national regulations without an international regulatory framework to level the playing field and to make sure that everyone is abiding by the same principles? Is that wishful thinking?
Well, I think we need both. I think we need to understand. I think we are starting now. There are a lot of national legislations having been adopted already. Just this summer, we had the Norwegian Transparency Act went into force, which gives consumers an enormous right to. We can write any company we want and have information about their supply chains. And if they're not reporting transparently about activities and supply chains and how they adhere to international standards, they can be penalized. The EU is proposing similar standards now, impelling also national governments to introduce such legislation. And I really think that is the way to go. And of course, Global Compact it has been important, incredibly important, but it's voluntary. And we have no way of enforcing it. So we need to find enforcement mechanisms. And and just to pick up on what's been said about development in India, in China, of course it's been important. I mean, yes, it is really great that we have seen economical development, development of middle class, education for more people. But we also need to stop thinking that that in itself makes real change happen. We have to still push it. China is less democratic than it was ever, probably.
All right, can we rely on a voluntary system of self-regulation? In the few seconds that we have left, we're going to extend the clock and make it a couple of minutes. I'm being told the magic that we have at our fingertips when we need it. Mahinthan, with you first. If you were to think of one commitment that you could make or that you would want a company to make to create that positive change, what would it be?
Well, charity begins at home. So when they will basically adhere to specific principles such as paying a rightful wage to employees, that includes female employees, because still maternity is an issue when it comes to hiring as well as pay. And also, like, for example, why are companies laying off people when they are still making a profit? Or why are companies paying their upper management a hefty benefit when they are actually making a loss and laying off people?
Underpaid, overworked labor. Mattis, more fairness, we just heard, for you. What would it be?
Yes, so I think from my perspective, the real important shift will come when these issues and these long-term priorities, whether it comes to human rights, whether it comes to internal labor, or obviously the sort of sustainability, environmental sustainability and climate change questions, when they become absolutely entrenched at the very, very top of the strategy of the business and strategy development for the businesses, and not be seen as treated as for a while, and in many companies, they have been either as a question for marketing or question for compliance, but really be entrenched fundamentally at the heart of the strategy for businesses. I think that is the moment where we will start seeing a structural change.
Thank you, Mattis. Berit, you have business leaders here today. What is your one ask? What is the one priority? What can you do? What should they do today?
Well, I assume those who have come here are those who don't need to hear that much because they already are interested and they really try to make a difference. I mean, I'm actually very optimistic, as I mentioned, because I see that developing. Before, they used to have CSR on a web page. Now we have the CEOs being the drivers for change in many companies. We just have to push for that to happen for those who don't want to. So those who don't want to have to be pushed to do the same thing. And we need to make them understand that it's for the better for them, it's better for the investors, it's better for the consumers, and it's better for all.
Good business making, or being good, making good business sense. For you, Paul?
Well, I just want to set the bar right. We can't be very happy. Inequality is going up, climate change is going up. Climate change is probably the biggest intergenerational injustice in the history of humanity. Soon, billions of people will be floating around the world. Millions of people are already losing their lives. We cannot sit here and say we are moving in the right direction. I don't buy it. We're actually moving in the wrong direction. So first of all is see reality in the eye. The second thing is business has to take responsibility, as we argue in our book Net Positive, of its total impact in the world, all consequences, intended or not. We have to be responsible for that. If I'm in the food business in Unilever, I have to be sure that the smallholder farmer has a decent livelihood, that people don't go to bed hungry, that there is not an issue of obesity on the other end. We have to be responsible. And the second thing business needs to do is change the definition of lobbying instead of fighting for their own interests and continue to derail what people want to do, is to become part of an increasing group of businesses that proactively encourages the politics to put the right frameworks in place. The Sustainable Standard Board starting to report on social and environmental capital next to financial capital. The legislation that Europe increasingly sets now that indirectly influences the rest of the world. That's the type of thing. Ultimately, we don't get there, if you like it or not, and it might not be something you hear too often from a business person, but we won't get there if we don't have the right legislation in place and if we're not able to enforce that legislation. It's as simple as that.
Proof is in the pudding.
The issues are too big for any company alone to solve that.
That's certainly true. It's the collective will that could make a difference here. For now, Paul, Berit, Mattis, and Mahinthan, thank you all very much indeed. And as you just mentioned, Paul, if the global uncertainty of the last few years and supply chain disruptions coupled with the energy crisis that we've been seeing has exacerbated tensions among and between nations, it's also increased the inequalities that we see around the world, the food shortages amid the surge in the price of wheat and other basic commodities. Just imagine this. In the year 2022, the number of people facing acute food insecurity, in other words, going to bed feeling hungry, is set to climb to 222 million. 222 million. That's according to the World Food Programme, the recipient of the 2020 Nobel Peace Prize Award for its work in acting as a driving force in efforts to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon of war. David Beasley, the former governor of the US state of South Carolina, has led the WFP, the World Food Programme, as its executive director since 2017. He joins us now with a couple of words.
I want to start by thanking the Nobel Peace Center and Hydro for asking me to take part in this year's Peace Prize celebrations. Thank you. It brings back a lot of incredibly wonderful memories of my visit to Oslo last year. Why? Because that's where we celebrated the World Food Programme's Nobel Peace Prize. What an amazing time. So, ladies and gentlemen, today, our world is facing the biggest hunger crisis we have seen in our lifetime. Right now, over 349 million people are marching towards starvation. That's over 200 million more than before the COVID pandemic. And also within that, 49 million of them in 49 countries are right on the brink of famine as we speak. In a world where humanitarian needs are far greater than the resources available to help the most vulnerable, we need everyone, and I mean everyone, to step up, and that includes the private sector. We will never end global hunger without the support and commitment of businesses everywhere. It is critical that the private sector be front and center. Fortunately, many companies now recognize the importance of contributing to positive social change, and they understand this means playing their part in many ways, ambitious multi-sectoral partnerships that address the root causes of hunger and society's other challenges. We're in this together. At WFP, we've been working with the private sector for over 20 years, and these partnerships take lots of different forms. Sometimes they involve setting up private sector networks at the country level to focus on a particular issue, such as providing specialist nutrition to children. We're working with our longtime partner, Royal DSM, for example, to set up these networks in 19 countries. Other times, we engage in wide-range global initiatives such as the Farm to Market Alliance. WFP and our Norwegian company Yara, for example, are two of the founding members of this initiative, which supports smallholder farmers so that they can grow crops for sale on commercial markets. This program has helped farmers across Africa build sustainable livelihoods which sustain their families. And we're also working with Yara, for example, on fertilizer, which is a critical issue right now around the world. Another Norwegian company, energy business Equinor, has given WFP much-needed funding for our operation in the Horn of Africa, where millions are currently at risk of famine and starvation. And I'm excited that the Novo Nordisk Foundation has just signed an agreement with WFP to support homegrown school feeding and smallholder farmer support programs in Rwanda and Uganda. These are all great examples of how the private sector can help tackle the humanitarian and social challenges confronting our world and contribute to building a better future. But we need every single business to step up and play its part. So please, I'm asking everyone today to come join us in our life-saving, life-changing mission and give every child the chance of a brighter tomorrow. Thank you.
As David Beasley just mentioned, with millions of people on the brink of famine, the private sector can and should play a more critical role. But will it rise to the occasion and put its money where its mouth is? Not just talk the talk, but actually walk the walk. Our second panel will explore the positive difference that businesses can make. What are the expectations? Are they realistic? What are the pitfalls? And does it all make business sense? There is a drive today to incorporate human rights into corporate policy and culture, as we heard in our first panel. Close to Norway, IKEA may have pioneered sustainability and the welfare of its workforce, and we know that Scandinavian countries in general are at the forefront of this issue. Amazon today is being encouraged to develop a human rights policy. And just last February, the European Commission adopted a proposal for a directive on corporate sustainability due diligence, introducing a human rights due diligence duty for financial and non-financial companies. So are we on the right path despite the less than optimistic outlook? Hilde Aasheim, you are the CEO of Hydro, a leading industrial company with mining and manufacturing operations in over 40 countries, some of them in underinvested and fragile communities like northern Brazil. It is one of the largest aluminum companies in the world, well over a century old. It's a literal economic powerhouse here in Norway. How can a company like Hydro, with such an impressive presence throughout the world, with such a long history, lead the way when it comes to extractive industries, lead the way towards more progressive, more corporate responsibility, and invest at the same time in local communities? How can it do all of that at once?
Well, thank you for that question. Let me start with a quote that has inspired me a lot. It was Kofi Annan that said, "Business cannot succeed if societies fail." And the purpose of Hydro, all the way back to 1905, has been to create viable societies by turning natural resources into products and solutions that the world needs in a responsible way. And that's the purpose that we have today in terms of being part of the solution. Back in 1905, the world was starving, and they found a way to take the nitrogen out of the air to produce fertilizers, which was solving the issue at that time. Today, we are in the middle of the climate crisis, and today Hydro is trying to, with low-carbon, zero-carbon aluminium and renewable energy, to be part of the solution when it comes to the energy crisis. But in Hydro, we believe that profitability and sustainability goes hand in hand. Not only believing, but we have strategies. We have as ambitious strategy in terms of sustainability as we have in profitability. And I believe that we will not be profitable long term if we are not taking part of the solutions in terms of climate, environment, but also the societal challenge that the world is facing. And we see that expectations are rising. But for me, as the leader of Hydro, I see that we will not be able to attract and retain the best people. We will not be able to be an attractive partner in business. We will not be able to attract ourselves when it comes to customers. And just a few days ago, there was one of my most precious customers called me just to discuss our human rights due diligence and how we are doing that. And it's a sign that our stakeholders, not only the shareholders asking for the return, the whole stakeholder community are starting to help us actually and incentivize us to do what is good for not only the business but also good for the planet. And that is encouraging as a leader to see that things are starting to move also in the consumer aspect. We just recently raised a new loan, where we got a discount on the interest simply because we stand out in terms of ESG reporting. So we build on the legacy of our founder, but it's good for business. It's good for the planet.
You say you build on the legacy of your founders. The world has changed, though, quite a bit, hasn't it, in the last century? Can you go back to that original vision of putting people at the center of your business model? You say that you meet with shareholders, and they say all of the right things, and perhaps they are genuine, but how easy is it for them to fully grasp, sitting in comfortable offices here in Europe, what is going on so many miles away in these underprivileged societies and communities? Hydro has had its own share of controversies in Brazil. In fact, in 2021, a Brazilian group sued the company for alleged pollution. You are a relatively new CEO. You've been in your position only since 2019. How can you change things around, not just the perceptions, but the reality of how business is conducted?
And then we have to learn also from experiences, because things are not necessarily going in the linear or the right direction all the time. So the lesson that we have learned in Brazil is really valuable in terms of realizing that at that time we didn't have any allies. We hadn't done the necessary trust building in the local community, that actually the local community wanted us to be there. And it was not only perception, but that we actually were able to do good things that supported our business in the local community in Brazil. And after that, we have done a lot of things in terms of making us a good neighbor, making us a strong, let's say, positive force in the local communities, not only in Brazil, but throughout where we operate. So I think there are dilemmas and there are pitfalls, and sometimes we go in them. And that is also what makes us even better, that we actually are able to learn and realize that this is much more important for us going forward. When I meet the community representatives in Barcarena in Brazil, that they tell me that it's good for them that we are there, that can support them. The grandmother took my hand saying, please employ my grandchild, please take him out of crime. And I'm really proud when I was there in November now that I handed over a technical school, which makes these young people having a skill that they can come to work. And that is how I see that we are building capabilities in the societies that at the end of the day is a win-win for the business, but also for the local community.
To admit mistakes are made when they are, and to learn from them, to earn the trust of these local communities, and by extension, as Paul was mentioning earlier, the trust of consumers ultimately, which translates onto the bottom line of major companies today. Rohitesh Dhawan, you are President and Chief Executive Officer of the International Council on Mining and Metals, the ICMM. It's a global leadership organization which was established 20 years ago. It is working for sustainable development through, quote, responsibly produced metals and minerals. The mining industry, though, is often seen as a culprit when it comes to the harm it causes both people and planet. How do you create responsible and sustainable mining when we see the underpinnings of the conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo going on for 30, some say 60 years now? Is there really room for hope? Have things really changed?
To use your own words, by walking the talk, because at the center of ICMM lies a very simple principle. We will never advocate for something if we're not prepared to do it ourselves. And so we make the principles that we commit to a binding requirement of being a member of ICMM. So let me give you a few examples of where I think that's led to some positive change and where I think we're failing. And before I do that, let me use Paul's words, actually, as an inspiration. The book that Paul wrote, Net Positive, has in it a wonderful part where he talks about when a quarter of any group does something. I think, Paul, I'm getting this right. When a quarter of any group does something, it starts to become the norm. Mm-hmm. Now, in our group, and Hilde's one of my favorite people in the group, we have 1/3 of the global mining industry represented. So I believe that when we act together, it will tip the scales in favor of that action. So a few areas where I think we're making some difference. We were the first industry in the world to collectively commit to become net zero. Paul said it doesn't help when a few companies do it. I'll tell you, when 1/3 of the industry speaks with one voice, it makes a difference. We're the first industry in the world to commit to report the tax we pay on a country-by-country basis from next year. Mm-hmm. I hope that becomes the norm for every other sector. We're one of the first industries in the world to commit to make all our contracts with governments public, no matter where we operate. I hope that becomes the norm. And for the last nearly 2 decades, we have committed not to operate in a World Heritage Site. Now, as we sit here today, many, many miles away in Montreal, world leaders gather to try and come up with a global treaty on nature. One of the simple requests I have made is, can we make it illegal to mine or do any other industrial activity in a World Heritage Site? It's one of the easiest things we can do to protect nature. So those are the areas I think we're doing okay. Let me mention 2 where I think we're really failing. Diversity, equity, and inclusion in our industry. Amongst the group of 26 CEOs, there are more people with the name Mark than there are women. And you are seeing the only woman sitting next to me in that group. And there are more people with the name that starts with M than there are people of color, myself included. Globally, 16% of our workforce is made up of women. I'm proud to say Hydro is higher than that. We're just not doing well enough. And if any of you read a report called the Everyday Respect Report that was published earlier this year, you will know that in mining workplaces, there is unacceptable levels of sexual assault, harassment, bullying, and discrimination. We have so much more to do.
Some interesting statistics, but back to the main issue, growth. Can we pursue relentless growth with the planet's finite resources? Because more growth means tapping more into nature. I mean, how do you square that circle? Because even if we know the planet is in peril, COP after COP after COP, it's difficult to be optimistic, isn't it?
It depends who you mean by we. Do you mean the average Qatari who emits 32 tons of CO2 per person per year?
We mean civil society.
But the point I want to make is we looks very different depending on which seat you sit in. The average Norwegian emits 6.7 tons, or do you mean the average Indian who emits 1.8 tons? And that, if we don't reckon with the fact that there is shared but differentiated responsibility for the crisis we face today, we will be stuck in this conversation for another 10 years. And so I think we have to recognize that the responsibility to do more rests with the people that have more. And so what I would love to see is the amount of material consumed per person in the rich world coming down as the amount of material consumed per person in the poor world going up. Right now, the average Norwegian uses 27 tons of raw material every year. The average person living in a poor country uses 2 tons of raw material every year. We need more steel, we need more aluminium, we need more copper to take people out of poverty. But in the rich world, we're going to have to learn to recycle more, consume less, and do more with less.
So I was going to say, it's an unfair question, but I'll ask it anyway. What is the solution? You've just put your finger on a couple of them. And you think these are realistic?
Yes, I think they're absolutely realistic. And if somebody wants a really neat way to put this all together, look at donut economics. Donut economics, great principle. We all exist within a minimum boundary, but nobody has too much.
All right, nobody has too much. Yngve Slyngstad, I wonder if you'll agree with that. You're the CEO of Aker Asset Management, a Norwegian industrial investment company listed here on the Oslo Stock Exchange. Previously, you served as the chief executive of Norway's sovereign wealth fund, which is considered one, if not the largest in the world. How much of a fundamental shift are you seeing in the way businesses view their human rights responsibilities? And as an investor, what does it look like for you? What responsibility do investors have?
So I think it is a fundamental shift that business is going through, although probably quite slow, as Paul says. It's definitely a sea change with regard to the way that investors are thinking about these issues. And I think if we look back, it kind of moved from, this was an issue that first hit maybe the consumer sector, where the consumers and the NGOs were pushing them on issues like child labor, supply chain, etc. Then it came, of course, with extractive industries. But what has happened, I think, since November 2015, with the COP21, is that it kind of now is something, these issues, affects absolutely every industry. And it starts to kind of affect more and more of businesses globally as well, not just the multinationals in the US and Europe, but all over the world. The consequence of this is, of course, that these issues have migrated from being something management can deal with, supply chain, to something the board has to deal with, reputational issues, license to operate. And now, sort of investors, you're the ultimate owners. How do you think about it? What are your strategic moves to make sure that these issues actually are taken care of on a day-to-day business? So I think there's definitely changed a lot, but it's been maybe late, and it's most of the changes actually happened the last decade.
What are investors today most nervous about? Or perhaps let's ask this more positively, what are they least nervous about? And when you look at the mining industry, it is making civil society nervous, isn't it? The loss of biodiversity, we talked about it, water management, safeguarding indigenous rights as well, not to mention the catastrophic damage it does do to the environment.
So there's no doubt that the one issue that is capturing most of the discussions is the climate change issue. Personally, I think this is just a starter. It's going to spread to all of the issues that most of the businesses through UN Global Compacts have signed up to, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I think this is just a time question. It's going to take another decade before the other issues get back into focus. But it's definitely the climate issue, which is the talk among business leaders and among investors.
What is the industry doing to make a difference besides hiring spin doctors? And we've seen them hire quite often the same spin doctors.
I think everybody is sort of thinking, well, what is actually our climate strategy? But as an investor or a business, let's try to formulate it, let's try to present it. That may sound like just general verbiage to start with, but then, of course, people will be held to account and will have to put up more concrete targets. things will be measured. CO2 emissions, of course, is reasonably easy to measure. And then you get the slight movement because what is measured is managed. And eventually what is managed is changing the way that business is conducted.
How much pressure does it does need to come from investors, do you think, Paul? I mean, is there a middle ground? Do we need to rethink fundamentally what the economic business model looks like today, making it more socially responsible, more inclusive? Is there a contradiction in terms?
No, I think so. So coming first to your first part of your question, the investor community, absolutely important role, because if we don't get the money to flow in the right direction, i.e. the solutions towards the Sustainable Development Goals, we're never going to get there. To implement these goals or to attack climate change, which is basically at the center of it, goal number 13, we need $3 to $5 trillion of incremental spending versus what we do today. It's not going to come from countries. The combined spending of countries in overseas development aid is 150 billion. So that has to come from the private sector. So we have to find the mechanisms ultimately to make it attractive. The good thing now is if you look at study after study after study, it points out that if we don't do anything and stay at this trajectory to go well above 3 degrees, we'll be fine probably, but a lot of people will be suffering. So that trajectory will give us a cost by 2070 of about $178 trillion. If we stay below 1.5 degrees, which is by all means possible, by the way, still, that if we act together, then we would have a benefit of $43 trillion. So the financial market has discovered, not surprisingly, that it's not only about providing retirement for people and decent returns so that these people can retire, but also to ensure that they can live in a world they can retire in. And increasingly they see that it's not a matter just of risk management, but they're rapidly moving to opportunity. That's why you see many of these funds making commitments to decarbonize. The famous 130 trillion Global Financial Alliance on Net Zero, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, the PRI principles. I mean, that's why you see that 80% of the questions that now shareholders are asking at these AGMs are related to ESG. That's why increasingly you see them demanding that the funds flow to the greener future, not the browner past. So it is happening. And here again, we just need to find mechanisms to accelerate that. And the major acceleration has to go towards the developing markets. Unfortunately, if you like it or not, I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you that we have to broadly discuss the opportunities in these emerging markets and give the people the chances. But the reality is that's 85% of the world population. That's going to be, even today, it's 60% of the new carbon emission. We just simply can't afford it. But what we can afford is to ensure that funds flow to these markets. So how do we change the risk equation? And this is where the multilateral banks come in, and the previous panel, for example. Right now, most of the multilateral banks, the IMF, the World Banks, the regional development banks, they are financing projects. Many of them actually the wrong projects. They're still financing coal as I sit here. But increasingly we should look at that money, which is all our money if you want to, or some of the major funds like the Norwegian funds. You should use that money as a catalytic. If you can, especially towards these emerging markets, which have a 6, 7, 8 times higher cost of borrowing, if you can actually provide them first risk or first loss protection, then you can attract in significant amounts the private sector money to start putting in the right solutions. So being very practical, 800 million people in the emerging markets don't have energy right now, access to energy, 1.3 billion intermittent energy. So I agree 100%. These people have the right to energy. That's a human right. Like it's a human right to not go to bed hungry, a human right to have water. So in order to provide these 800 million people with energy, we don't want them to get coal. We don't want them to get fossil fuel because it really doesn't add up anymore. Would we be stupid? So how do we give them green energy? So clearly for the private sector, it's not commercially viable to do that now. But if we use the multilateral institutions and put in the blended financing, we've raised now $10 billion with high net worth individuals you referred to and foundations and all that. We can leverage that up to $150 billion. And you can actually attack an issue like that at scale. So creativity in these partnerships is what you look for. My final comment on the financial market, which is the most important comment for business to understand, is there is something called the weighted impact impact accounts that George Sarasan at Harvard studied, where he looked at 3,500 companies, more or less. He ranks those companies by industry sector: shipping, airlines, steel, aluminum, food. You get the point. And what he finds is, not surprising to me, but surprising to many CEOs, the companies that more aggressively attack the negative externalities are actually already higher valued by the market. So whilst people talk about non-materiality or the accounting standards, don't need to reflect this or that or the other, the smart part of the financial market is already calculating that in. A company that is more sustainable, that more aggressively attacks climate change, that has a more gender diverse board and an organization, they're already higher valued. So the interest of the shareholders longer term, and I put the word longer term once more, and these multiple stakeholders are increasingly converging. And that is the good news. So how can we accelerate that? That's what we need.
Lack of common rules and standards. Your thoughts, Rohitesh and Hilde? And Yngve, of course, your thoughts on what you just heard. Do you agree or disagree with the bulk of what you've just heard?
Look, maybe I can tell a story and do a mea culpa of where I think our industry really, really screwed up badly, and the role of investors. In 2019, a dam collapsed where we store mine waste at Vale's operations in Brumadinho and killed 270 people. It was one of the darkest days in the industry, and the industry came together with the UN and the Principles for Responsible Investment to then develop a new global industry standard for how we manage tailings facilities to try and prevent this from ever happening again. And it's become a condition of membership for us that we have to implement that standard. But actually where the investors have really helped is that the investors have said, we will not invest in any company that doesn't apply that standard. I mean, that's not hard to do. I mean, that's very easy to do. Similarly, it's for investors to speak out on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm not saying that we've got it all figured out, because we will get the heat, and we should get the heat. But that's an example of where the investor community can and has played a role.
Yeah, I think in most investors' mind, the first kind of accident that sort of pulled this the whole way to the top was BP Macondo and Deepwater Horizon, because how much money is one accident actually able to cost investors? An enormous amount, right? With regards to Paul's comment about how are we actually going to finance this energy transition, it's really a new industrial revolution we have to do. It's so much money involved that you have to get businesses going. There is no other way to do it. You will not be able to do it with government funding alone. It's the biggest investment challenge ever. And I think if you start to look at it, there are basically things that has to be done in more or less every industry. And the industries directly accounts for more than 30% of the emissions. So we'll have a huge challenge in front of us.
Hilde, so how difficult is it for you to make a difference on a large scale when the competition isn't necessarily abiding by the same set of rules and standards?
Well, I think you have to, in a way, believe in what you're doing, and that you eventually will get the uplift like Paul is talking about, in terms of investors that believe that there is a risk of being a laggard and the risk of not doing this. And you painted a very bleak picture of the mining and metal industry, but realizing that these materials are essential for the green shift, for the energy shift. But obviously we have to raise the standard. We have to demonstrate that we can produce these materials in a sustainable way, and we have learned a lesson in the mining industry. But there are also a lot of technologies that are now coming in terms of reducing the footprint, but also in terms of regenerating, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of we have set a standard now of avoiding landfills at all in the bauxite mining. And then we talked about recycling. I mean, the fact that you can bring the materials back after use, like we are now recycling electrical vehicle batteries, where we bring back the cobalt, the magnesium, the lithium back in the loop. And I think the recycling and regeneration will be so important for the sustainability of this planet, and also for the population that can not have the same as we have. I think that will be so important.
Kate, Paul, some of the issues we touched on here, shareholders versus stakeholders, that dilemma, but also making sure that when you have a company with such a global footprint, such a huge sprawling infrastructure, how can you ensure that human rights is protected and respected through all of the different layers? of production when it is so fragmented? And do you think that capitalism, as we know it, is really showing its failings, its contradictions? Do we need a rethink?
Well, we do. That's what we've talked in the panel. So there's definitely a need for change. But
what kind of change?
I think we all agree with that. So what you first have to do with companies is to really, as I said before, ensure that they take responsibility of their total impact in the world. 80% of companies still claim I don't have transparency on scope 3, when we know that most of the carbon emissions, for example, are in scope 3. So you have to say, like now coming in legislation, both in the US with the SEC and in Europe, that we require companies to disclose their scope 3 emissions. So the more you publicize, the more you force companies to report on things like on diversity or like on human rights, the modern day slavery act that for example, the more you force companies to publish, you can really see a step change. There is something about transparency that drives behavior. And then you need to find the critical mass of companies, which indeed, as I write in my book, is 20–25%, to really give the governments courage to move faster on some things and put the right legislation in place. You simply won't get there. By the way, you won't get there by dwelling on these companies that don't get it, which are increasingly becoming a minority, and you don't get there either at scale, at the speed that we need, if you don't get the legislation in place. So the strategy that we are focused on entirely is to get by industry, because it's most of industry-related issues, get a critical mass of these companies together to actually de-risk the political process and get the right legislation in place earlier. And it is starting to happen. And where and when we see that happen, you get quite transformative changes.
Yngve, are you seeing that transformative change? Is it trickling all the way down? Are you seeing transparency in every layer that you'd like to see as an investor? Or do you tend to turn a blind eye? It doesn't matter. The bottom line is what really matters.
Yeah, it has been slow. Kind of how do we move from word to action? Well, we have to move from words to numbers, and then from numbers to measurement, and so on. So it's coming, and it's even coming into legislation now in some countries. So it's happening, right? It's just that these processes take a very long time, and that's the nature of it. I think the question about the market economy is yeah, does it have some inherent weaknesses? Yes, of course, it's one very obvious one. The commons, as we call it, the atmosphere, the virgin forest, the world oceans, there's no price on this. Right? If you just rely on the price mechanism, you will not get this into the equation. So we have to find a different way of measuring this. And this is what a lot of this new measurement is about. How do we measure the loss of forests, biodiversity, CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? And this is really about, we don't have the pricing mechanism to fix it for us, find another way. And I think ultimately what we're really talking about here is if the industry can get down to the industry standards, there's not going to be reduced profitability for the investors or anyone else. It just has to be an equal playing field. And that has to go across regions also. It has to involve all parts of the world, all companies, whatever jurisdiction they're operating in.
Rohitesh, do you want to see more pressure from investors? I know you wrote an open letter just now in the lead up to COP27, essentially putting the onus on governments, political leaders, saying they need to take bold action, but we've waited long for them to take bold action. Where is change really going to come from? The private industry, investors, where is it going to come from?
Well, clearly all of the above, but the question is who's going to step up and be counted? Yeah. As Paul says, our role as a collective is to de-risk the political process because, let me tell you a story.
And you need trillions of dollars as well to make change happen.
You do, but you know, in 2014, the companies that made up ICMM at the time came out and said, we support a carbon price. People said, what? We said, no, we support a carbon price. We need a carbon price. It's the only way to solve climate change. 7 years later, do we have a carbon price? No. But the whole point was that if any government negotiator stood up at COP 21, 22, 23, whatever, and said, we'd love to put a carbon price in, but you know, the industry would complain, we could show them, no, we want you to do it. That was the point of the open letter. The point of my open letter to governments in Montreal was, if you think that protecting nature would be seen as a negative from the industry, you are wrong. Because we have been taking actions on nature for far longer than political leaders have been talking biodiversity at a serious level. So I think what Paul says is absolutely right, which is let's stand up and be counted and show leadership so that political leaders can use that as a way to increase their own ambitions, and it becomes a virtuous cycle.
The price on carbon, in other words, tax.
Correct.
On carbon, isn't it? More or less the same, which always scares off political leaders and governments.
Yeah, but it's not a tax. It doesn't have to be a tax. There's a carbon dividend proposal in the US, which is called the Baker-Schulz proposal, which is very good. You have cap-and-trade systems. It doesn't have to be a tax, the word tax. And by the way, tax is not bad at all. Although a quarter of the Fortune 500 companies still don't pay tax, which we talk about in our book, which I think is quite irresponsible. But tax is not a bad thing. I'm happy. I've always said in Unilever, I'm happy to pay 25% tax, which is actually what we worked with the OECD, with Angel Correa, then, with the BEPS proposal. It would be good if countries in the world come in with a more uniform tax system. I think most companies, responsible companies, will embrace that. There will always be some against, but I think the world is ready for that. Tax is not a bad word, just like profits is not a bad word. But at the end of the day, we need to change our accounting system. If we only measure the return on financial capital, and some people are very good at it, but if we include human, social, environmental capital, that's why the work and the launch of the Sustainable Standard Board at the COP26 in Glasgow, or the work on the European taxonomy is so important. That is really the way to change things.
Absolutely. And from all of this to another very hot topic of the moment, but it's obviously all fitting together. The FIFA World Cup in Qatar, as we mentioned earlier, bringing up all these different dilemmas at once, the role of big corporations, what stand they should take when it comes to allegations of human rights abuses by a host nation. Do they take part? Do they boycott? I'm pleased to say that we have with us Lisa Klaveness. For anyone who does not follow Norwegian football very closely, she is president of Norway's Football Association, the first woman to be in that position. It did pay off for her to keep an orange ball by her side growing up as a child, wherever she went, including to bed. And if you haven't heard her speak recently at the FIFA Congress back in March, well, you missed an important statement, and you'll know that she does not mince her words. Lisa, Norway opted for dialogue, as I say, and pressure, but dialogue rather than boycott of the FIFA World Cup, despite the alleged abuses of human rights when it comes to migrant workers in Qatar. How challenging, how unpopular was it to put ethics and respect for human rights at the center of a major global event when so many major corporations, yes, and massive investments as well are made? What are the key dilemmas that raised for you, and what key dilemmas does it raise for the panelists here today?
Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad that you turn around, because on the football field, to be behind someone, it's uncomfortable for you. You have to see the pressure behind you. No, I think we were in all sorts of dilemmas. I think for us in Norway to address this issue, being a very small country, we haven't been to a World Cup for 22 years. We're no one in football, but we're getting there, by the way. Was difficult, because you know that you have to collaborate, you have to be part of a bigger team, and that we deal with football. So we're suddenly in this geopolitical area, but we know that football is also geopolitical. We know that Qatar got the World Cup also by upping the game, not just doing corruption, face to face with the persons in the committee, but going to states, going to Sarkozy, going, above the football. So we know that we are very conservative. Like you said, Paul, the sense of urgency has not come to football yet. I think that the Qatar award, I have to say though, to start there, this is not, an attack on Qatar or the Middle East. This is how the debate ends up, racism. No, this is the money ideology. In Norwegian, we call it gullkalven. It's the gold in the middle, and we don't have transparency. We're not rigged to divide this money in a fair way, so that we make very bad decisions. They start with the World Cup. It's an area as big as Bergen, where I'm from. Bergen should not have the World Cup, by the way. I have to say that. So it's not about the Middle East culture. It's not about Sharia versus the Christian culture. It's about transparency, changes behavior. You said, Paul, which is true, and we haven't had real transparency in football. And the decision was very, very bad. It cost life. But I do think the good part about the award to Qatar was that it was the stick that made the donkey's back break. I think so. I think we will have now a big pressure going out of the World Cup, that we need to have those industrial standards that you say, Yngve, because football has been very afraid of politics. I meet people all the time. I was new in Doha when I made the speech. I'd been president for 3 weeks. I did not know anyone. Maybe that made me so stupid, you know, and naive, because I did not respect anyone more than I did with the doorman, or they were just people to me, men, by the way. And then when we went to the speech to address the Congress, I realized that this is a very dangerous topic to address. And why? You know, we're in this area all the time, and I think, firstly, the leaders in football are very afraid to lose control because we're so media close. So when we address this, now I'm asked every day, what about Palestine? What about Israel? I don't know. You know, I cannot solve all these problems. We cannot solve all these problems, but we can have, like Berit, my colleague, or you're not my colleague because you're independent in the ethical committee of the Norwegian Football Federation, said we need legislation, industrial standards in football that, you know, makes the world stage, which the football has all the time, a good symbol of change. Because now we're a bad symbol. You know, we love the sport. We love that people are gathered. You know, the beauty and the power of the football sport is really strong, and it should not be a cliche. It should not be something we just say to have a glossy front. It really has, but it has cost lives. We have had awards to World Cups. We have had decisions made that cost lives, and that we cannot live with.
But again, the skeptics will say, how do you make sure that respect for human rights aren't applied selectively? And I know you have a question, perhaps, for one of the panelists.
Yeah, because I do think the change for us is that to go beyond compliance. Of course we have to, and we have been behind. But then we need help, we need pressure from ethical committees, we need medias, of course we do, we need companies. And Hydro has been there without really debate in Norway for 50 years. I know that you've done great work there, but still I also know how media pressure is very difficult. It makes leaders afraid, and you have not had that, not the same scale as we have had. And we need to share this. So I want to ask you, how has Hydro, has been there for so many years, handled with the modern slavery that has been in Qatar, and how have you handled the pressure of knowing that you're in a country where the human rights is on a systematically level not being adhered to?
Yeah, as you say, we have been in Qatar for 50 years. Right now we are operating an aluminium smelter together in a joint venture with Qatar Petroleum. When we built it 10-15 years ago, we did a new economic and environmental study and realized that there was issues relating to the workforce. So in order to have a good working conditions, when we built the plant with 25,000 workers, we built a village and spent 700 million kroner to create for a good living conditions for the people that build the plant. Today, we use the same industrial standards, the same ethical standards as we have in Sunndalsøra, as we have in Qatalum. The same values that we have in Hydro is present in Qatalum. In terms of the well-being, and we have 47 different nationalities, and the focus from the very beginning was the well-being and safety of the people. And today, Qatalum stands out in the Hydro portfolio of 140 sites as one of the best in terms of safety. In terms of dialogue with the organization in Qatar, there's a law saying that you cannot have unions, but we have safety delegates, which we have constant dialogue with in terms of how is the plant operating, how is the engagement, what can we do more of. I have personally been on the board of Qatalum for 10 years. And I have influenced many times in the discussion of contractors, for example, in terms of where they are living and their living conditions. In terms of paying slightly more, in terms of having a good condition. And I have been to camps myself to see that these workers have a good condition to live. Well, how could they actually do the work at the plant, driving a truck with 960 degrees metal on the back, if they were hungry, if they didn't sleep at night? And so But when you are operating in a global environment, you have to decide where can you be and where can you not be. You have the choice, you can leave, or you can stay and influence. And I feel that we as Hydro, with also the relationship that we have with the joint venture partners, which is the minister of the oil and gas, or the gas, is owning the half of the plant. I met with them regularly, talked about the conditions in the plant. That he find it a little bit special that I every time go and see the people in the plant. And I'm telling him that because I want to influence, that this is the most important for me, that it's the people in the plant that is actually making the products. So I have always felt that by being there, we can influence. We cannot set the laws, but we can influence. And we have had regular relationship with ILO. We have talked about these things. So we would be happy to share our experience in terms of how we can operate in an environment. And particularly now, in Hydro, we have the diversity, inclusion and belonging as one of our top agendas these days, not only in Qatar, but throughout the world. And there are different issues in the US, in Brazil, even in Norway, where we want to have more female operators. So we set the agenda, and I believe that is worthwhile doing.
The wisdom of being there and engaging rather than walking away and boycotting. Thank you very much. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Lisa Klaveness. Paul, very quickly. Before I move on to each and every one of you with closing comments, Paul, quickly to you. Based on what you've just heard, as a former CEO, someone who's represented so many big brands in the world, do you think there was too much emphasis and focus, and still is, on Qatar hosting the World Cup, on these human rights abuse allegations? I mean, or does it really bring up some, how should I put this gently, hypocrisy? Because they're not the only ones who've
there is
been
hypocrisy, and I think there are very few countries in the world that have a perfect record on human rights. So it's all a little bit in the eye of the beholder, because we have different value systems. We also have different definitions there. So it's not so easy for business. And in Unilever, I've always been proactively pushing, like you do, in trying to change the systems. I actually went into Myanmar, but we didn't deal with the military. We dealt with the people that wanted to change it for the better. So I've never run away from things, because I don't think that's a solution. But, here is the dilemma. Spending 200 billion is ridiculous for a soccer tournament. Doing that in that country with bribes and getting that raises a lot of questions. The treatment of LGBT in this country passes all standards for most countries in the world. And then on top of that, having lost 6,500 workers, at least in the construction of these stadiums, is not something that anybody can be proud of. But we're all watching soccer. So that's the dilemma a little bit. So if out of this...
In closing, what are your recommendations?
So the fact that this is a big debate right now, I think is positive, because we've had many Olympics where these issues were there as well, and the debate wasn't there. So it shows there's progress. The fact that FIFA now is working with the ILO on labor principles for future tournaments is something positive coming out of that. The fact that they're now looking again at different human rights principles, because FIFA has discovered, which is a rude awakening in my opinion, but they've discovered that the way they were running it is not acceptable anymore. So they have to change, just as every other company had to change. And if that's a good thing coming out of that, we can be proud. But hopefully we won't repeat the mistakes of Qatar, if I call it that way. And the speech, by the way, of the president, may I say publicly, was appalling, because he didn't really quite get it, what the sentiment of the people was. But if at the end of the day it leads to change in FIFA, which inherently is a very corrupt institution, like some other things, then that's a good thing. And I think we should embrace that. So I think it's positive in a sense.
What is positive for you, Yngve, in closing?
So I think it's one thing that's happened in 2022 that we should be cognizant of. In the beginning of the year, we had an invasion that not all countries condemned. In the end of the year, we have a discussion around a football event. We have to be careful that what we consider global values will remain global values, not Western values. We have to be very conscious of promoting the positive aspects of countries where we are visiting or being guests in, and carrying a dialogue with a positive note to it.
Rohitesh, in 20 seconds.
Walk the talk. Let's none of us preach something we're not practicing ourselves.
The final word to you, Hilde. Positives and negatives, but in a nutshell.
Positive and negatives
of the
well,
moment
I think we, as Yngve say, we should also focus on the positives. That there is a sentiment in the consumers, in the customers, in terms of valuing partners that have the sustainability on the top of the agenda. We will definitely continue to work. Next week we launch our Scope 3 targets, and I think the procurement power that we as global companies have to set the stage for more transparency and how we source our materials from people that also are producing responsibly.
As you say, we all have a role to play. Paul, Hilde, Rohitesh, Yngve, thank you very much indeed. On behalf of the organizers of this event, Hydro and the Nobel Peace Center, let me thank you all for being part of this discussion, for following us online, and for being here today. As consumers, as we just heard, we all have a huge say. We have a role to play in how businesses conduct themselves. It is our duty to get informed, get outraged, get inspired, get active, as Anita Roddick once said. So let us be courageous, let us make a difference. It was a pleasure for me to be here today with you all. Thank you to Hydro and to the Nobel Peace Center for bringing us all together. Thanks very much.